inquiring whether I was the person who had recently occupied rooms at Wall Street. Full of forebodings, I replied that I was. "Then, sir," said the stranger, who proved a lawyer, "you are responsible for the man you left there. He refuses to do any copying. He refuses to do anything. He says he prefers not to, and he refuses to quit the premises." "I am very sorry, sir," said I, with assumed tranquility, but an inward tremor. "But really, the man you allude to is nothing to me. He is no relation or apprentice of mine, that you should hold me responsible for him." "In mercy's name, who is he?" "I certainly cannot inform you. I know nothing about him. Formerly, I employed him as a copyist, but he has done nothing for me now for some time past." "I shall settle him then. Good morning, sir." Several days passed and I heard nothing more, and though I often felt a charitable prompting to call at the place to see poor Bartleby, yet a certain squeamishness of I know not what withheld me. All is over with him by this time, thought I, at last, when, through another week, no further intelligence reached me. But coming to my room the day after, I found several persons waiting at my door in a high state of nervous excitement. "That's the man, here he comes," cried the foremost one, whom I recognized as the lawyer who had previously called upon me alone. "You must take him away, sir, at once," cried a portly person among them, advancing upon me, and whom I knew to be the landlord of Wall Street. "These gentlemen, my tenants, cannot stand it any longer. Mr. B," pointing to the lawyer, "has turned him out of his room, and now he persists in haunting the building generally, sitting upon the banisters of the stairs by day and sleeping in the entry by night. Everybody is concerned. Clients are leaving the offices. Some fears are entertained of a mob. Something you must do, and that without delay." Aghast at this torrent, I fell back before it, and would fain have locked myself in my new quarters. In vain I persisted that Bartleby was nothing to me, no more to me than anyone else. In vain, I was the last person known to have anything to do with him, and they held me to the terrible account, fearful then of being exposed in the papers as one person present obscurely threatened. I considered the matter and at length said that if the lawyer would give me a confidential interview with the scrivener in his, the lawyer's, own room, I would, that afternoon, strive my best to rid them of the nuisance they complained of. Going upstairs to my old haunt, there was Bartleby silently sitting upon the banister at the landing. "What are you doing here, Bartleby?" said I. "Sitting upon the banister," he mildly replied. I motioned him to the lawyer's room, who then left us. "Bartleby," said I, "are you aware that you are the cause of great tribulation to me, by persisting in occupying the entry after being dismissed from the office?" No answer. Now, one of two things must take place. Either you must do something, or something must be done to you. Now, what sort of business would you like to engage in? Would you like to re-engage in copying for someone? No, I would prefer not to make any change. Would you like a clerkship in a dry goods store? There is too much confinement about that. No, I would not like a clerkship, but I am not particular. Too much confinement, I cried. Why, you keep yourself confined all the time. I would prefer not to take the clerkship, he rejoined, as if to settle that little item at once. How would a bartender's business suit you? There is no trying of the eyesight in that. I would not like it at all, though as I said before, I am not particular. His unwonted wordiness inspirited me. I returned to the charge. Well then, would you like to travel through the country collecting bills for the merchants? That would improve your health. No, I would prefer to be doing something else. How then would going as a companion to Europe to entertain some young gentleman with your conversation How would that suit you? Not at all. It does not strike me that there is anything definite about that. I like to be stationary, but I am not particular. Stationary you shall be then, I cried, now losing all patience and, for the first time in all my exasperating connection with him, fairly flying into a passion. If you do not go away from these premises before night, I shall feel bound, indeed, I am bound to quit the premises myself, I rather absurdly concluded, knowing not with what possible threat to try to frighten his immobility into compliance. Despairing of all further efforts, I was precipitately leaving him, when a final thought occurred to me, one that had not been wholly unindulged before. Bartleby, said I, in the kindest tone I could assume under such exciting circumstances, will you go home with me now? Not to my office, but my dwelling, and remain there till we can conclude some convenient arrangement for you at our leisure? Come, let us start now, right away. No. At present, I would prefer not to make any change at all. I answered nothing, but effectually, dodging everyone by the suddenness and rapidity of my flight, rushed from the building, ran up Wall Street towards Broadway, and, jumping into the first omnibus, was soon removed from pursuit. As soon as tranquillity returned, I distinctly perceived that I had now done all that I possibly could, both in respect to the demands of the landlord and his tenants, and with regard to my own desire and sense of duty to benefit Bartleby and shield him from rude persecution. I now strove to be entirely carefree and quiescent, and my conscience justified me in the attempt, though indeed it was not so successful as I could have wished. So fearful was I of being again hunted out by the incensed landlord and his exasperated tenants that, surrendering my business to nippers for a few days, I drove about the upper part of the town and through the suburbs in my rockaway, crossed over to Jersey City and Hoboken, and paid fugitive visits to Manhattanville and Astoria. In fact, I almost lived in my rockaway for the time. When again I entered my office, lo, a note from the landlord lay upon the desk. I opened it with trembling hands. It informed me that the writer had sent to the police and had Bartleby removed to the Tombs as a vagrant. Moreover, since I knew more about him than anyone else, he wished me to appear at that place and make a suitable statement of the facts. These tidings had a conflicting effect upon me. At first I was indignant, but at last almost approved. The landlord's energetic, summary disposition had led him to adopt a procedure which I do not think I would have decided upon myself, and yet, as a last resort, under such peculiar circumstances, it seemed the only plan. As I afterwards learned, the poor scrivener, when told that he must be conducted to the Tombs, offered not the slightest obstacle, but in his pale, unmoving way, silently acquiesced. Some of the compassionate and curious bystanders joined the party, and, headed by one of the constables arm in arm with Bartleby, the silent procession filled its way through all the noise and heats and the joy of the roaring thoroughfares at noon. The same day I received a note. I went to the Tombs, or, to speak more properly, the halls of justice. Seeking the right officer, I stated the purpose of my call, and was informed that the individual I described was indeed within. I then assured the functionary that Bartleby was a perfectly honest man, and greatly to be compassionated, however unaccountably eccentric. I narrated all I knew, and closed by suggesting the idea of letting him remain in as indulgent confinement as possible till something less harsh might be done, though indeed I hardly knew what. At all events, if nothing else could be decided upon, the almshouse must receive him. I then begged to have an interview. Being under no disgraceful charge, and quite serene and harmless in all his ways, they had permitted him freely to wander about the prison, and especially in the enclosed grass-platted yards thereof. And so I found him there, standing all alone in the quietest of yards, his face towards a high wall, while all around, from the narrow slits of the jail windows, I thought I saw peering out upon him the eyes of murderers and thieves. "Bartleby, I know you," he said, without looking round, "and I want nothing to say to you." "It was not I that brought you here, Bartleby," said I, keenly pained at his implied suspicion. "And to you, this should not be so vile a place. Nothing reproachful attaches to you by being here. And see, it is not so sad a place as one might think. Look, there is the sky, and here is the grass." "I know where I am," he replied, but would say nothing more. And so I left him. As I entered the corridor again, a broad meat-like man in an apron accosted me, and jerking his thumb over his shoulder, said, "Is that your friend?" "Yes. Does he want to starve? If he does, let him live on the prison fare. That's all." "Who are you?" asked I, not knowing what to make of such an unofficially speaking person in such a place. "I am the grub man. Such gentlemen as have friends here hire me to provide them with something good to eat." "Is this so?" said I, turning to the turnkey. He said it was. "Well then," said I, slipping some silver into the grub man's hand, for so they called him, "I want you to give particular attention to my friend there. Let him have the best dinner you can get, and you must be as polite to him as possible." "Introduce me, will you?" said the grub man, looking at me with an expression which seemed to say he was all impatience for an opportunity to give a specimen of his breeding. Thinking it would prove to benefit the scrivener, I acquiesced, and, asking the grub man his name, went up with him to Bartleby. "Bartleby, this is a friend. You will find him very useful to you." "Your servant, sir, your servant," said the grub man, making a low salutation behind his apron. "Hope you find it pleasant here, sir. Nice grounds, cool apartments. Hope you'll stay with us some time. Try to make it agreeable." "What will you have for dinner today?" "I prefer not to dine today," said Bartleby, turning away. "It would disagree with me. I am unused to dinners." So saying, he slowly moved to the other side of the enclosure and took up a position fronting the dead wall. "How's this?" said the grub man, addressing me with a stare of astonishment. "He's odd, ain't he?" "I think he's a little deranged," said I, sadly. "Deranged, is it? Well now, upon my word, I thought that friend of yourn was a gentleman forger. They are always pale and genteel-like, them forgers. I can't help pity 'em. Can't help it, sir." "Did you know Monroe Edwards?" he added touchingly, and paused. Then, laying his hand piteously on my shoulder, sighed. "He died of consumption at Sing Sing." "So you weren't acquainted with Monroe?" "No, I was never socially acquainted with any forgers, but I cannot stop longer. Look to my friend yonder. You will not lose by it. I will see you again." Some few days after this, I again obtained admission to the tombs and went through the corridors in quest of Bartleby, but without finding him. "I saw him coming from his cell not long ago," said a turnkey. "Maybe he's gone to loiter in the yards." So I went in that direction. "Are you looking for the silent man?" said another turnkey, passing me. "Yonder he lies, sleeping in the yard there. 'Tis not 20 minutes since I saw him lie down." The yard was entirely quiet. It was not accessible to the common prisoners. The surrounding walls, of amazing thickness, kept off all sounds behind them. The Egyptian character of the masonry weighed upon me with its gloom, but a soft imprisoned turf grew underfoot. The heart of the eternal pyramids, it seemed, wherein, by some strange magic, through the clefts, grass seed, dropped by birds, had sprung. Strangely huddled at the base of the wall was his knees drawing up, and lying on his side, his head touching the cold stones, I saw the wasted Bartleby. But nothing stirred. I paused, then went close up to him, stooped over, and saw that his dim eyes were open. Otherwise, he seemed profoundly sleeping. Something prompted me to touch him. I felt his hand when a tingling shiver ran up my arm and down my spine to my feet. The round face of the grubman peered upon me now. His dinner is ready. Won't he dine today either? Or does he live without dining? Lives without dining, said I, and closed the eyes. Hey, he's asleep, ain't he? With kings and counsellors, murmured I. There would seem little need for proceeding further in this history. Imagination will readily supply the meagre recital of poor Bartleby's interment. But ere parting with the reader, let me say that if this little narrative has sufficiently interested him to awaken curiosity as to who Bartleby was, and what matter of life he led prior to the present narrator's making his acquaintance, I can only reply that in such curiosity I fully share, but am wholly unable to gratify it. Yet here I hardly know whether I should divulge one little item of rumour which came to my ear a few months after the scrivener's decease. Upon what basis it rested I could never ascertain, and hence how true it is I cannot now tell. But inasmuch as this vague report has not been without a certain suggestive interest to me, however sad, it may prove the same with some others, and so I will briefly mention it. The report was this: that Bartleby had been a subordinate clerk in the dead letter office at Washington, from which he had been suddenly removed by a change in the administration. When I think over this rumour, hardly can I express the emotions which seize me. Dead letters, does it not sound like dead men? Conceive a man by nature and misfortune prone to a pallid hopelessness. Can any business seem more fitted to heighten it than that of continually handling these dead letters and assorting them for the flames? For by the cartloads they are annually burned. Sometimes from out the folded paper the pale clerk takes a ring, the finger it was meant for, perhaps smoulders in the grave. A banknote sent in swiftest charity, he whom it would relieve, nor eats nor hungers any more. Pardon for those who died despairing, hope for those who died unhoping, good tidings for those who died stifled by unrelieved calamities. On errands of life, these letters speed to death. Ah, Bartleby! Ah, humanity! Benito Sereno. In the year 1799, Captain Amasa Delano of Duxbury in Massachusetts, commanding a large sealer and general trader, lay at anchor with a valuable cargo in the harbour of St. Maria, a small, desert, uninhabited island toward the southern extremity of the long coast of Chile. There he had touched for water. On the second day, not long after dawn, while lying in his berth, his mate came below, informing him that a strange sail was coming into the bay. Ships were not then so plenty in those waters as now. He rose, dressed, and went on deck. The morning was one peculiar to that coast. Everything was mute and calm, everything grey. The sea, though undulated into long roods of swells, seemed fixed, and was sleeked at the surface like wave lead that had cooled and set in the smelter's mould. The sky seemed a grey surtout. Flights of troubled grey fowl, kith and kin with flights of troubled grey vapours, among which they were mixed, skimmed low and fit fully over the waters, as swallows over meadows before storms. Shadows present, foreshadowing deeper shadows to come. To Captain Delano's surprise, the stranger, viewed through the glass, showed no colours, though to do so upon entering the haven, however uninhabited in its shores, where but a single other ship might be lying, was the custom among peaceful seamen of all nations. Considering the lawlessness and loneliness of the spot and the sort of stories at that day associated with those seas, Captain Delano's surprise might have deepened into some uneasiness had he not been a person of a singularly undistrustful good nature, not liable, except on extraordinary and repeated incentives, and hardly then to indulge in personal alarms any way involving the imputation of malign evil in man. Whether, in view of what humanity is capable, such a trait implies, along with a benevolent heart, more than ordinary quickness and accuracy of intellectual perception, may be left to the wise to determine. But whatever misgivings might have obtruded on first seeing the stranger would almost in any seaman's mind have been dissipated by observing that the ship, in navigating into the harbour, was drawing too near the land, a sunken reef making out of her bow. This seemed to prove her a stranger, indeed, not only to the sealer, but the island. Consequently, she could be no wanted freebooter on that ocean. With no small interest, Captain Delano continued to watch her, a proceeding not much facilitated by the vapours partly mantling the hull, through which the far, matin light from her cabin streamed equivocally enough, much like the sun, by this time hemisphered on the rim of the horizon, and apparently in company with the strange ship entering the harbour, which, wimpled by the same low, creeping clouds, showed not unlike a lemur intriguance, one sinister eye peering across the plaza from the Indian loophole of her dusk saye manta. It might have been but a deception of the vapours, but the longer the stranger was watched, the more singular appeared her manoeuvres. Ere long, it seemed hard to decide whether she meant to come in or know what she wanted or what she was about. The wind, which had breezed up a little during the night, was now extremely light and baffling, which the more increased the apparent uncertainty of her movements. Surmising at last that it might be a ship in distress, Captain Delano ordered his whaleboat to be dropped, and much to the wary opposition of his mate, prepared to board her and at the least pilot her in. On the night previous, a fishing party of the seamen had gone a long distance to some detached rocks, out of sight from the sealer, and an hour or two before daybreak had returned, having met with no small success. Presuming that the stranger might have been long off soundings, the good captain put several baskets of the fish, for presents, into his boat, and so pulled away. From her continuing too near the sunken reef, deeming her in danger, calling to his men, he made all haste to apprise those on board of their situation. But some time ere the boats came up, the wind, light though it was, having shifted, had headed the vessel off, as well as partly broken the vapours from about her. Upon gaining a less remote view, the ship, when made signally visible on the verge of the leaden-hued swells, with the shreds of fog here and there raggedly furring her, appeared like a whitewashed monastery after a thunderstorm, seen perched upon some dun cliff among the Pyrenees. But it was no purely fanciful resemblance which now, for a moment, almost led Captain Delano to think that nothing less than a shipload of monks was before him, peering over the bulwarks were what really seemed, in the hazy distance, throngs of dark cowls, while fitfully revealed through the open portholes, other dark-moving figures were dimly descried, as of black friars pacing their cloisters. Upon a still nigher approach, this appearance was modified, and the true character of the vessel was plain, a Spanish merchantman of the first class, carrying Negro slaves, amongst other valuable freight, from one colonial port to another. A very large and, in its time, a very fine vessel, such as in those days were at intervals encountered along that main, sometimes superseded Acapulco treasure ships or retired frigates of the Spanish King's Navy, which, like superannuated Italian palaces, still under a decline of masters, preserved signs of former state. As the whaleboats drew more and more nigh, the cause of the peculiar pipe-clayed aspect of the stranger was seen in the slovenly neglect pervading her. The spars, ropes, and great part of the bulwarks looked woolly from long unacquaintance with the scraper, tar, and the brush. Her keel seemed laid, her ribs put together, and she launched from Ezekiel's valley of dry bones. In the present busyness in which she was engaged, the ship's general model and rig appeared to have undergone no material change from the original warlike and Frisart pattern. However, no guns were seen. The tops were large and were railed about with what had once been octagonal network, all now in sad disrepair. These tops hung overhead like three ruinous aviaries, in one of which was seen perched on a ratlin, a white noddy, a strange fowl, so called from its lethargic, somnambulistic character, being frequently caught by hand at sea. Battered and mouldy, the castellated forecastle seemed some ancient turret, long ago taken by assault and then left to decay. Toward the stern, two high-raised quarter galleries, the balustrades here and there covered with dry, tindery sea moss, opening out from the unoccupied state cabin whose dead lights, for all the mild weather, were hermetically closed and corked. These tenantless balconies hung over the sea as if it were the grand Venetian canal. But the principal relic of faded grandeur was the ample oval of the shield-like sternpiece, intricately carved with the arms of Castile and Leon, medallioned about by groups of mythological and symbolical devices, uppermost and central of which were a dark satyr in a mask, holding his foot on the prostrate neck of a writhing figure, likewise masked. Whether the ship had a figurehead or only a plain beak was not quite certain, owing to canvas wrapped about that part, either to protect it while undergoing a refurbishing, or else decently to hide its decay. Rudely painted or chalked, as in the sailor freak, along the forward side of a sort of pedestal below the canvas was the sentence, "Follow your leader," while upon the tarnished headboards nearby appeared in stately capitals, once gilt, the ship's name, San Dominic, each letter streakingly corroded with trickling of copper spike rust, while like morning weeds, dark festoons of seagrass slimily swept to and fro over the name, with every hearse-like roll of the hull. As at last the boat was hooked from the bow along toward the gangway amidship, its keel, while yet some inches separated from the hull, harshly grated as on a sunken coral reef. It proved a huge bunch of conglobated barnacles adhering below the water to the side like a wen, a token of baffling airs and long calms passed somewhere on those seas. Climbing the side, the visitor was at once surrounded by a clamorous throng of whites and blacks, but the latter outnumbering the former more than could have been expected, Negro transportation ship as the stranger in port was. But in one language, and as was with one voice, all poured out a common tale of suffering, in which the negresses, of whom there were not a few, exceeded the others in the dolorous vehemence. The scurvy, together with the fever, had swept off a great part of their number, more especially the Spaniards. Off Cape Horn they had narrowly escaped shipwreck. Then for days together they had lain tranced without wind, their provisions were low, their water next to none, their lips that moment were baked. While Captain Delano was thus made the mark of all eager tongues, his one eager glance took in all faces with every other object about him. Always upon first boarding a large and populous ship at sea, especially a foreign one, With a nondescript crew such as Lascars or Manila men, the impression varies in a peculiar way from that produced by first entering a strange house with strange inmates in a strange land. Both house and ship, the one by its walls and blinds, the other by its high bulwarks like ramparts, hoard from view their interiors till the last moment. But in the case of the ship, there is this addition, that the living spectacle it contains, upon its sudden, complete disclosure, has, in contrast with the blank ocean which zones it, something of the effect of enchantment. The ship seems unreal, these strange costumes, gestures and faces, but a shadowy tableau, just emerged from the deep, which directly must receive back what it gave. Perhaps it was some such influence as above is attempted to be described, which, in Captain Delano's mind, heightened whatever, upon a staid scrutiny, might have seemed unusual, especially the conspicuous figures of 4 elderly, grizzled Negroes, their heads like black, doddered willow tops, who, in venerable contrast to the tumult below them, were couched, sphinx-like, one on the starboard cat-head, another on the larboard, and the remaining pair face to face on the opposite bulwarks above the main chains. They each had bits of unstranded old junk in their hands, and with a sort of stoical self-content, were picking the junk into oakum, a small heap of which lay by their sides. They accompanied the task with a continuous, low, monotonous chant, droning and drilling away like so many grey-headed bagpipers playing a funeral march. The quarterdeck rose into an amply elevated poop, upon the forward verge of which, lifted like the oakum pickers, some 8 feet above the general throng, sat along in a row, separated by regular spaces, the cross-legged figures of 6 other blacks, each of a rusty hatchet in his hand, which, with a bit of brick and a rag, he was engaged like a scullion in scouring, while between each two was a small stack of hatchets, their rusted edges turned forward, awaiting a like operation. Though occasionally the 4 oakum pickers would briefly address some person or persons in the crowd below, yet their 6 hatchet polishers neither spoke to others nor breathed a whisper among themselves, but sat intent upon their task, except at intervals, when with the peculiar love in Negroes of uniting industry with pastime, 2 and 2 they sideward clashed their hatchets together like cymbals with a barbarous din. All 6, unlike the generality, had the raw aspect of unsophisticated Africans. That first comprehensive glance which took in those 10 figures with scores less conspicuous rested but an instant upon them as, impatient of the hubbub of voices, the visitor turned in quest of whomsoever it might be that commanded the ship. But as if not unwilling to let nature make known her own case among his suffering charge, or else in despair of restraining it for a time, the Spanish captain, a gentlemanly, reserved-looking and rather young man to a stranger's eye, dressed with singular richness but bearing plain traces of recent sleepless cares and disquietudes, stood passively by, leaning against the mainmast, at one moment casting a dreary, spiritless look upon his excited people, at the next an unhappy glance toward his visitor. By his side stood a black of small stature, in whose rude face, as occasionally like a shepherd's dog, he mutely turned it up into the Spaniard's. Sorrow and affection were equally blended. Struggling through the throng, the American advanced to the Spaniard, assuring him of his sympathies and offering to render whatever assistance might be in his power, to which the Spaniard returned for the present but grave and ceremonious acknowledgments, his national formality dusked by the saturnine mood of ill health. But losing no time in mere compliments, Captain Delano, returning to the gangway, had his basket of fish brought up, and as the wind still continued light, so that some hours at least must elapse ere the ship could be brought to the anchorage, he bade his men return to the sealer and fetch back as much water as the whaleboat could carry, with whatever soft bread the steward might have, all the remaining pumpkins on board, with a box of sugar and a dozen of his private bottles of cider. Not many minutes after the boat's pushing off, to the vexation of all, the wind entirely died away, and the tide turning began drifting back the ship helplessly seaward. But, trusting this would not last long, Captain Delano sought with good hopes to cheer up the strangers, feeling no small satisfaction that, with persons in their condition, he could, thanks to his frequent voyages along the Spanish Main, converse with some freedom in their native tongue. While left alone with them, he was not long in observing some things tending to heighten his first impressions. But surprise was lost in pity, both for the Spaniards and blacks, alike evidently reduced from scarcity of water and provisions, while long-continued suffering seemed to have brought out the less good-natured qualities of the Negroes, besides, at the same time, impairing the Spaniards' authority over them. But under the circumstances, precisely this condition of things was to have been anticipated. In armies, navies, cities, or families, in nature herself, nothing more relaxes good order than misery. Still, Captain Delano was not without the idea that, had Benito Cereno been a man of greater energy, misrule would hardly have come to the present pass. But the debility, constitutional or induced by hardships, bodily and mental, of the Spanish captain was too obvious to be overlooked. A prey to settled dejection, as if long mocked with hope, he would not now indulge it, even when it had ceased to be mocked. The prospect of that day, or even at furthest, lying at anchor with plenty of water for his people, and a brother captain to counsel and befriend, seemed in no perceptible degree to encourage him. His mind appeared unstrung, if not still more seriously affected, shut up in these oaken walls, chained to one dull round of command, whose unconditionality cloyed him. Like some hypochondriac abbot, he moved slowly about, at times suddenly pausing, starting or staring, biting his lip, biting his fingernail, flushing, paling, twitching his beard, with other symptoms of an absent or moody mind. This distempered spirit was lodged, as before hinted, in as distempered a frame. He was rather tall, but seemed never to have been robust, and now with nervous suffering was almost worn to a skeleton. A tendency to some pulmonary complaint appeared to have been lately confirmed. His voice was like that of one with lungs half gone, hoarsely suppressed, a husky whisper. No wonder that, as in this state he tottered about, his private servant apprehensively followed him. Sometimes the Negro gave his master his arm, or took his handkerchief out of his pocket for him, performing these and similar offices with that affectionate zeal which transmutes into something filial or fraternal acts in themselves but menial, and which has gained for the Negro the repute of making the most pleasing body servant in the world, one too whom a master need be on no stiffly superior terms with, but may treat with familiar trust, less a servant than a devoted companion. Marking the noisy indocility of the blacks in general, as well as what seemed the sullen inefficiency of the whites, it was not without humane satisfaction that Captain Delano witnessed the steady good conduct of Babo. But the conduct of Babo, hardly more than the ill behaviour of others, seemed to withdraw the half-lunatic Don Benito from his cloudy languor. Not that such precisely was the impression made by the Spaniard on the mind of his visitor. The Spaniard's individual unrest was, for the present, but noted as a conspicuous feature in the ship's general affliction. Still, Captain Delano was not a little concerned at what he could not help taking for the time to be Don Benito's unfriendly indifference towards himself. The Spaniard's manner, too, conveyed a sort of sour and gloomy disdain, which he seemed at no pains to disguise. But this the American in charity ascribed to the harassing effects of sickness, since in former instances he had noted that there are peculiar natures on whom prolonged physical suffering seems to cancel every social instinct of kindness, as if forced to blackbreed themselves. They deemed it but equity that each person coming nigh them should indirectly, by some slight or affront, be made to partake of their fare. But ere long Captain Delano bethought him that, indulgent as he was at the first, in judging the Spaniard, he might not after all have exercised charity enough. At bottom it was Don Benito's reserve which displeased him, but the same reserve was shown towards all but his faithful personal attendant. Even the formal reports which, according to sea usage, were, at stated times, made to him by some petty underling, either a white, mulatto, or black, he hardly had patience enough to listen without betraying contemptuous aversion. His manner upon such occasions was, in its degree, not unlike that which might be supposed to have been his imperial countryman's, Charles V, just previous to the Anchoritish retirement of that monarch from the throne. The splenetic disrelish of his place was evinced in almost every function pertaining to it. Proud as he was moody, he condescended to no personal mandate. Whatever special orders were necessary, their delivery was delegated to his body servant, who in turn transferred them to their ultimate destination through runners, alert Spanish boys or slave boys, like pages or pilot fish, within easy call, continually hovering around Don Benito, so that to have beheld his undemonstrative, invalid gliding about, apathetic and mute, no landsman could have dreamed that in him was lodged a dictatorship beyond which, while at sea, there was no earthly appeal. Thus, the Spaniard, regarded in his reverse, seemed the involuntary victim of mental disorder. But in fact, his reserve might, in some degree, have proceeded from design. If so, then here was evinced the unhealthy climax of that icy, though conscientious policy more or less adopted by all commanders of large ships, which, except in signal emergencies, obliterates alike the manifestation of sway with every trace of sociality, transforming the man into a block, or rather, into a loaded cannon, which, until there is call for thunder, has nothing to say. Viewing him in this light, it seemed but a natural token of the perverse habit induced by a long course of such hard self-restraint that, notwithstanding the present condition of his ship, the Spaniard should still persist in a demeanour which, however harmless, or it may be appropriate, in a well-appointed vessel, such as the San Dominic might have been at the outset of the voyage, was anything but judicious now. But the Spaniard perhaps thought that it was, with captains as with gods, reserve, under all events, must still be their cue. But probably this appearance of slumbering dominion might have been but an attempted disguise to conscious imbecility, not deep policy, but shallow device. But be all this as it might, whether Don Benito's manner was designed or not, the more Captain Delano noted its pervading reserve, the less he felt uneasiness at any particular manifestation of that reserve towards himself. Neither were his thoughts taken up by the captain alone, wonted to the quiet orderliness of the sealer's comfortable family of a crew. The noisy confusion of the San Dominic's suffering host repeatedly challenged his eye. Some prominent breaches, not only of discipline but of decency, were observed. These Captain Delano could not but ascribe, in the main, to the absence of those subordinate deck officers to whom, along with higher duties, is entrusted what may be styled the police department of a populous ship. True, the old oaken pickers appeared at times to act the part in monitorial constables to their countrymen. The blacks, but though occasionally succeeding in allaying trifling outbreaks, now and then between man and man, they could do little or nothing toward establishing general quiet. The San Dominic was in the condition of a transatlantic emigrant ship, among whose multitude of living freight are some individuals, doubtless as little troublesome as crates and bales. But the friendly remonstrances of such, with their ruder companions, are of not so much avail as the unfriendly arm of the mate. What the San Dominic wanted was what the immigrant ship has: stern superior officers. But on these decks, not so much as a fourth mate was to be seen. The visitor's curiosity was roused to learn the particulars of those mishaps which had brought about such absenteeism with its consequences, because, though deriving some inkling of the voyage from the whales which at the first moment had greeted him, yet of the details no clear understanding had been had. The best account would doubtless be given by the captain, yet at first the visitor was loth to ask it, unwilling to provoke some distant rebuff. But, plucking up courage, he at last accosted Don Benito, renewing the expression of his benevolent interest, adding that he, Captain Delano, but to know the particulars of the ship's misfortunes, he would, perhaps, be better able in the end to relieve them. Would Don Benito favour him with the whole story? Don Benito faltered, then, like some somnambulist, suddenly interfered with, vacantly stared at his visitor, and ending by looking down on the deck. He maintained this posture so long that Captain Delano, almost equally disconcerted and involuntarily almost as rude, turned suddenly from him, walking forward to accost one of the Spanish seamen for the desired information. But he had hardly gone 5 paces when, with a sort of eagerness, Don Benito invited him back, regretting his momentary absence of mind and professing readiness to gratify him. While most of the story was being given, the two captains stood on the after part of the main deck, a privileged spot, no one being near but the servant. "It is now 190 days," began the Spaniard, in his husky whisper, "that this ship, well officered and well manned, with several cabin passengers, some 50 Spaniards in all, sailed from Buenos Aires, bound to Lima, with a general cargo, hardware, Paraguay tea, and the like, and, pointing forward, that parcel of negroes, now not more than 150 as you see, but then numbering over 300 souls. Off Cape Horn we had heavy gales. In one moment by night, 3 of my best officers with 15 sailors were lost, with the main yard, the spar snapping under them in the slings, as they sought with heavers to beat down the icy sail. To lighten the hull, the heavier sacks of matter were thrown into the sea, with most of the water pipes lashed on deck at the time. And this last necessity it was, combined with the prolonged detections afterwards experienced, which eventually brought about our chief causes of suffering, when, here, there was a sudden fainting attack of his cough, brought on, no doubt, by his mental distress. His servant sustained him, and, drawing a cordial from his pocket, placed it to his lips, but he little revived. But unwilling to leave him unsupported while yet imperfectly restored, the black with one arm still encircled his master, at the same time keeping his eye fixed on his face, as if to watch for the first sign of complete restoration or relapse, as the event might prove. The Spaniard proceeded, but brokenly and obscurely, as one in a dream. "Oh God! Rather than pass through what I have with joy, I would have hailed the most terrible gales, but—" His cough returned, and with increased violence, this subsiding, with reddened lips and closed eyes, he fell heavily against his supporter. His mind wanders. He was thinking of the plague that followed the gales, plaintively sighed the servant. "My poor, poor master," wringing one hand and with the other one wiping the mouth. "But be patient, senor," again turning to Captain Delano. "These fits do not last long. Master will soon be himself." Don Benito, reviving, went on, But as this portion of the story was very brokenly delivered, the substance only will here be set down. It appeared that after the ship had been many days tossed in storms off the Cape, the scurvy broke out, carrying off numbers of the whites and blacks. When at last they had worked round into the Pacific, their spars and sails were so damaged and so inadequately handled by the surviving mariners, most of whom had become invalids, that, unable to lay her northerly course by the wind, which was powerful, the unimaginable ship, for successive days and nights, was blown northwestward, where the breeze suddenly deserted her in unknown waters to sultry calms. The absence of the water pipes now proved as fatal to life as before their presence had menaced it. Induced, or at least aggravated, by the more than scanty allowance of water, a malignant fever followed the scurvy, with the excessive heat of the lengthened calm, making such short work of it as to sweep away, as by billows, whole families of the Africans, and a yet larger number, proportionably, of the Spaniards, including, by the luckless fatality, every remaining officer on board. Consequently, in the smart west winds eventually following the calm, the already rent sails, having to be simply dropped, not furled at need, had been gradually reduced to the beggar's rags they were now. To procure substitutes for his lost sailors, as well as supplies of water and sails, the captain, at the earliest opportunity, had made for Valdivia, the southernmost civilized port of Chile and South America. But upon nearing the coast, the thick weather had prevented him from so much as sighting that harbour, since which period, almost without a crew, and almost without canvas, and almost without water, and at intervals giving its added dead to the sea, the San Dominic had been battle-dawed about by contrary winds, inveigled by currents, or grown weedy in calms. Like a man lost in woods, more than once she had doubled her own track. But throughout these calamities, huskily continued Don Benito, painfully turning in the half-embrace of his servant, I have to thank those negroes, you see, who, though to your inexperienced eyes appearing unruly, have indeed conducted themselves with the less of restlessness than even their owner could have thought possible under such circumstances. Here he again fell faintly back. Again his mind wandered, but he rallied, and less obscurely proceeded. Yes, their owner was quite right in assuring me that no fetters would be needed with his blacks, so that while, as is wont in this transportation, those negroes have always remained upon deck, not thrust below, as in the Guinea men, they have also, from the beginning, been freely permitted to range within given bounds at their pleasure. Once more the faintness returned. His mind roved, but, recovering, he resumed. But it is Babbo here to whom, under God, I owe not only my own preservation, but likewise to him, chiefly, the merit is due, of pacifying his more ignorant brethren, when at intervals tempted to murmurings. Ah, master, sighed the black, bowing his face, don't speak of me. Babbo is nothing. What Babbo has done was but duty. Faithful fellow, cried Captain Delano. Don Benito, I envy you such a friend. Slave I cannot call him. As master and man stood before him, the black upholding the white, Captain Delano could not but bethink him of the beauty of that relationship which could present such a spectacle of fidelity on the one hand and confidence on the other. The scene was heightened by the contrast in dress, denoting their relative positions. The Spaniard wore a loose, chilly jacket of dark velvet, white small clothes and stockings with silver buckles at the knee and instep, a high-crowned sombrero of fine grass, a slender sword, silver-mounted, hung from a knot in his sash, the last being an almost invariable adjunct, more for utility than ornament, of a South African gentleman's dress to this hour. Excepting when his occasional nervous contortions brought about disarray, there was a certain precision in his attire, curiously at variance with the unsightly disorder around, especially in the belittered ghetto, forward of the main mast, wholly occupied by the blacks. The servants wore nothing but wide trousers, apparently from their coarseness and patches, made out of some old topsail. They were clean and confined at the waist by a bit of unstranded rope which, with his composed, deprecatory air at times, made him look something like a begging friar of St. Francis. However unsuitable for the time and place, at least in the blunt-thinking American's eyes, and however strangely surviving in the midst of all his afflictions, the toilette of Don Benito might not in fashion at least have gone beyond the style of the day among South Americans of his class, though on the present voyage sailing from Buenos Aires, he had avowed himself a native and resident of Chile, whose inhabitants had not so generally adopted the plain coat and once plebeian pantaloons, but, with a becoming modification, adhered to their provincial costume, picturesque as any in the world. Still, relatively to the pale history of the voyage and his own pale face, there seemed something so incongruous in the Spaniard's apparel as almost to suggest the image of an invalid courtier tottering about London streets in the time of the plague. The portion of the narrative which perhaps most excited interest as well as some surprise, considering the latitudes in question, was the long calm spoken of, and more particularly the ship so long drifting about. Without communicating the opinion, of course, the American could not but impute at least part of the detentions both to clumsy seamanship and faulty navigation. Eyeing Don Benito's small yellow hands, he easily inferred that the young captain had not got into command at the horsehole, but the cabin window, and if so, why wonder at incompetence in youth, sickness, and gentility united? But drowning criticism in compassion, after a fresh repetition of his sympathies, Captain Delano, having heard out his story, not only engaged, as in the first place, to see Don Benito and his people supplied in their immediate bodily needs, but also now farther promised to assist him in procuring a large, permanent supply of water, as well as some sails and rigging, and though it would involve no small embarrassment to himself, yet he would spare 3 of his best seamen for temporary deck officers, so that without delay the ship might proceed to Conception, there fully to refit for Lima, her destined port. Generosity was not without its effect, even upon the invalid. His face lighted up, eager and hectic. He met the honest glance of his visitor. With gratitude, he seemed overcome. "This excitement is bad for master," whispered the servant, taking his arm and with soothing words gently drawing him aside. When Don Benito returned, the American was pained to observe that his hopefulness, like the sudden kindling in his cheek, was but febrile and transient. Ere long, with a joyless mien, looking up towards the poop, the host invited his guest to accompany him there for the benefit of what little breath of wind might be stirring. As, during the telling of the story, Captain Delano had once or twice started at the occasional cymballing of the hatchet polishers, wondering why such an interruption should be allowed, especially in that part of the ship, and in the ears of the invalid, and moreover, as the hatchets had anything but an attractive look, and the handlers of them still less so, it was therefore, to tell the truth, not without some lurking reluctance, or even shrinking it may be, that Captain Delano, with apparent complacence, acquiesced in his host's invitation. The more so, since with an untimely caprice of punctilio, rendered distressing by his cadaverous aspect, Don Benito, with his Castilian bows, solemnly insisted upon his guests preceding him up the ladder leading to the elevation where, one on each side of the last step, sat for armorial supporters and sentries, two of the ominous file. Gingerly enough stepped good Captain Delano between them, and in the instant of leaving them behind, like one running the gauntlet, he felt an apprehensive twitch in the calves of his legs. But when facing about, he saw the whole file, like so many organ grinders, still stupidly intent on their work, unmindful of everything beside. He could not but smile at his late, fidgety panic. Presently, while standing with his host, looking forward upon the decks below, he was struck by one of those instances of subordination previously alluded to. 3 black boys with 2 Spanish boys were sitting together on the hatches, scraping a rude wooden platter in which some scanty mess had recently been cooked. Suddenly, one of the black boys, enraged at a word dropped by one of his white companions, seized a knife and, though called to forbear by one of the oakum pickers, struck the lad over the head, inflicting a gash from which blood flowed. In amazement, Captain Delano inquired what this meant, to which the pale Don Benito dully muttered that it was merely the sport of the lad. Pretty serious sport, truly, rejoined Captain Delano. Had such a thing happened on board the Bachelor's Delight, instant punishment would have followed. At these words, the Spaniard turned upon the American one of his sudden, staring, half-lunatic looks, then relapsing into his torpor, answered, doubtless, Signor. Is it, thought Captain Delano, that this hapless man is one of those paper captains I've known, who by policy wink at what by power they cannot put down? I know no sadder sight than a commander who has little of command but the name. I should think, Don Benito, he now said, glancing towards the oakum picker who had sought to interfere with the boys, that you would find it advantageous to keep all your blacks employed, especially the younger ones, no matter at what useless task and no matter what happens to the ship. Why, even with my little band, I find such a course indispensable. I once kept a crew of my quarterdeck thrumming mats for my cabin, when, for 3 days, I had given up my ship mats, men, and all for a speedy loss, owing to the violence of a gale in which we could do nothing but helplessly drive before it. Doubtless, muttered Don Benito. But, continued Captain Delano, again glancing upon the oakum pickers and then at the hatchet polishers nearby, I see you keep at least some of your host employed. Yes, was again the vacant response. Those old men there shaking their pals from their pulpits, continued Captain Delano, pointing to the oakum pickers, seemed to act the part of old dominies. To the rest, little heeded as their admonitions are at times. Is this voluntary on their part, Don Benito, or have you appointed them shepherds of your flock of black sheep? What post they fill, I appointed them, rejoined the Spaniard, in an acrid tone, as if resenting some supposed satiric reflection. And these others, continued Captain Delano, rather uneasily, eyeing the brandished steel of the hatchet polishers where in spots it had been brought to a shine, these seem a curious business, Don Benito. In the gales we met, answered the Spaniard. What of our general cargo was not thrown overboard was much damaged by the brine. Since coming to calm weather, I have had several cases of knives and hatchets daily brought up for overhauling and cleaning. A prudent idea, Don Benito. You are part owner of ship and cargo, I presume, but none of the slaves, perhaps. I am owner of all you see, impatiently returned Don Benito, except the main company of blacks who belonged to my late friend, Alexandro Aranda. As he mentioned this name, his air was heartbroken. His knees shook. His servant supported him. Thinking he divined the cause of such unusual emotion, to confirm his surmise, Captain Delano, after a pause, said, "And may I ask, Don Benito, whether since a while ago you spoke of some cabin passengers, the friend whose loss so afflicts you at the outset of the voyage accompanied his blacks?" "Yes, but died of fever. Died of the fever. Oh, could I but." Again quivering, the Spaniard paused. "Pardon me," said Captain Delano, lowly, "but I think that, by a sympathetic experience, I conjecture, Don Benito, what it is that gives the keener edge of your grief. It was once my hard fortune to lose, at sea, a dear friend, my own brother, then supercargo. Assured of the welfare of his spirit, its departure I could have borne like a man, but that honest eye, that honest hand, both of which had so often met mine, and that warm heart, all like scraps to the dogs, to throw all to the sharks. It was then I vowed never to have for fellow voyager a man I loved, unless, unbeknown to him, I had provided every requisite in case of a fatality for embalming his mortal part for interment on shore. Were your friend's remains now on board this ship, Don Benito, not thus strangely would the mention of his name affect you." "On board this ship?" echoed the Spaniard. Then, with horrified gestures as directed against some spectre, he unconsciously fell into the ready arms of his attendant, who, with a silent appeal towards Captain Delano, seemed beseeching him not again to broach a theme so unspeakingly distressing to his master. This poor fellow now, thought the pained American, is the victim of that sad superstition which associates goblins with the deserted body of man as ghosts with an abandoned house. How unalike we are made! What to me in like case would have been a solemn satisfaction, even the bare suggestion terrifies the Spaniard into this trance. Poor Alexandro Aranda. What would you say? Could you here see your friend who, on former voyages, when you for months were left behind, has, I dare say, often longed and longed for one peep at you, now transported with terror at the least thought of having you anyway nigh him? At this moment, with a dreary graveyard toll betokening a flaw, the ship's forecastle bell, smote by one of the grizzled oakum pickers, proclaimed 10 o'clock through the leaden calm, when Captain Delano's attention was caught by the moving figure of a gigantic black emerging from the general crowd below and slowly advancing towards the elevated poop. An iron collar was about his neck, from which depended a chain, thrice wound round his body, and the terminating links padlocked together at a broad band of iron his girdle. "How like a mute a two-foal moves," murmured the servant. The black mounted the steps of the poop, and, like a brave prisoner brought up to receive sentence, stood in unquailing muteness before Don Benito, now recovered from his attack. At the first glimpse of his approach, Don Benito had started. A resentful shadow swept over his face, and, as with the sudden memory of bootless rage, his white lips glued together. There is some mulish mutineer, thought Captain Delano, surveying, not without a mixture of admiration, the colossal form of the Negro. "See, he waits your question, master," said the servant. Thus reminded Don Benito, nervously averting his glance as if shunning by anticipation some rebellious response, in a disconcerted voice, thus spoke: "A two-foal. Will you ask my pardon now?" The black was silent. "Again, master," murmured the servant, with bitter upbraiding, eyeing his countryman. "Again, master. He will bend to master yet." "Answer," said Don Benito, still averting his glance. Say but the one word, pardon, and your chains shall be off. Upon this, the black, slowly raising both arms, let them lifelessly fall, his links clanking, his head bowed, as much as to say, "No, I am content." "Go," said Don Benito, with inkempt and unknown emotion. Deliberately as he had come, the black obeyed. "Excuse me, Don Benito," said Captain Delano, "but this scene surprises me. What means it, pray?" "It means that the Negro alone, of all the band, has given me peculiar cause of offence. I have put him in chains. Here he paused, his hand to his head, as if there were a swimming there, or a sudden bewilderment of memory had come over him, but meeting his servant's kindly glance, seemed reassured, and proceeded. "I could not scourge such a form, but I told him he must ask my pardon. As yet he has not. At my command, every 2 hours he stands before me. And how long has this been? Some 60 days? And obedient in all else? And disrespectful?" "Yes. Upon my conscience, then," exclaimed Captain Delano impulsively. "He has a royal spirit in him, this fellow." "He may have some right to it," bitterly returned Don Benito. "He says he was king in his own land." "Yes," said the servant, entering the word. "Those slits in Atufol's ears once held wedges of gold. But poor Babbo here, in his own land, was only a poor slave. A black man's slave was Babbo, and now is the whites." Somewhat annoyed by these conversational familiarities, Captain Delano turned curiously upon the attendant, then glanced inquiringly at his master, but as if long wonted to these little informalities, neither master nor man seemed to understand him. "What, pray, was Atufol's offence, Don Benito?" asked Captain Delano. "If it was not something very serious, take a fool's advice and, in view of his general docility, as well as in some natural respect for his spirit, remit him his penalty." "No, no, master will never do that," here murmured the servant to himself. "Proud Atufo must first ask master's pardon. The slave there carries the padlock, but master here carries the key." His attention thus directed, Captain Delano now noticed for the first that, suspended by a slender silken cord from Don Benito's neck, hung a key. At once, from the servant's muttered syllables, divining the key's purpose, he smiled and said, "So, Don Benito, padlock and key, significant symbols truly." Biting his lip, Don Benito faltered. Though the remark of Captain Delano, a man of such native simplicity as to be incapable of satire or irony, had been dropped in playful allusion to the Spaniard's singularly evident lordship over the black, yet the hypochondriac seemed some way to have taken it as a malicious reflection upon his confessed inability thus far to break down, at least on a verbal summons, the entrenched will of the slave. Deploring this supposed misconception, yet despairing of correcting it, Captain Delano shifted the subject, but finding his companion more than ever withdrawn, as if still sourly digesting the lees and the presumed affront above mentioned, by and by, Captain Delano likewise became less talkative, oppressed against his own will by what seemed the secret vindictiveness of the morbidly sensitive Spaniard. But the good sailor himself, of a quite contrary disposition, refrained on his part, alike from the appearance as from the feeling of resentment, and if silent, was only so from contagium. Presently, the Spaniard, assisted by his servant, somewhat discourteously crossed over from his guest, a procedure which, sensibly enough, might have been allowed to pass for idle caprice of ill humour, had not master and man, lingering around the corner of the elevated skylight, began whispering together in low voices. This was unpleasing, and more, the moody air of the Spaniard, which at times had not been without a sort of valetudinarian stateliness, now seemed anything but dignified, while the menial familiarity of the servant lost its original charm of simple-hearted attachment. In his embarrassment, the visitor turned his face to the other side of the ship. By so doing, his glance accidentally fell on a young Spanish sailor, a coil of rope in his hand, just stepped from the deck of the first round of the mizzen rigging. Perhaps the man would not have been particularly noticed, were it not that during his ascent to one of the yards, he, with a sort of covert intentness, kept his eye fixed on Captain Delano, from whom presently it passed, as if by a natural sequence, to the two whisperers. His own attention thus redirected to that quarter, Captain Delano gave a slight start. From something in Don Benito's manner just then, it seemed as if the visitor had, at least partly, been the subject of the withdrawn consultation going on, a conjecture as little agreeable to the guest as it was little flattering to the host. The singular alternations of courtesy and ill-breeding in the Spanish captain were unaccountable, except on one of two suppositions: innocent lunacy or wicked imposture. But the first idea, though it might naturally have occurred to an indifferent observer, and in some respect had not hitherto been wholly a stranger to Captain Delano's mind, yet now that in an incipient way he began to regard the stranger's conduct something in the light of an intentional affront, of course, the idea of lunacy was virtually vacated. But if not a lunatic, what then? Under the circumstances, would a gentleman, nay, any honest boor, act the part now acted by his host? The man was an impostor, some low-born adventurer masquerading as an oceanic grandee, yet so ignorant of the first requisites of mere gentlemanhood as to be betrayed into the present remarkable indecorum. That strange ceremoniousness too, at other times evinced, seemed not so uncharacteristic of one playing a part above his real level. Benito Sereno, Don Benito Sereno, a sounding name. One too at that period, not unknown in the surname, to supercargoes and sea captains trading along the Spanish Main as belonging to one of the most enterprising and extensive mercantile families in all those provinces, several members of it having titles, a sort of Castilian Rothschild, with a noble brother or cousin in every great trading town of South America. The alleged Don Benito was in early manhood, about 29 or 30, to assume a sort of roving cadetship in the maritime affairs of such a house. What more likely scheme for a young man, knave of talent and spirit? But the Spaniard was a pale invalid, never mind, for even to the degree of simulating mortal disease, the craft of some tricksters had been known to attain. To think that, under the aspect of infantile weakness, the most savage energies might be couched, those velvet of the Spaniard, but the silky paw to his fangs. From no train of thought did these fancies come, not from within, but from without, suddenly too, and in one throng, like hoar frost, yet as soon to vanish as the mild sun of Captain Delano's good nature regained its meridian. Glancing over once more towards his host, whose side face revealed above the skylight was now turned towards him, he was struck by the profile, whose clearness of cut was refined by the thinness incident to ill health, as well as ennobled about the chin by the beard. Away with suspicion, he was a true offshoot of a true Hidalgo Sereno. Relieved by these and other better thoughts, the visitor, lightly humming a tune, now began indifferently pacing the poop, so as not to betray to Don Benito that he had at all mistrusted incivility, much less duplicity. for such mistrust would yet be proved illusory, and by the events, though for the present, the circumstance which had provoked that distrust remained unexplained. But when that little mystery should have been cleared up, Captain Delano thought he might extremely regret it. Did he allow Don Benito to become aware that he had indulged in ungenerous surmises? In short, to the Spaniard's black letter text, it was best for a while to leave open margin. Presently, his pale face twitching and overcast, the Spaniard, still supported by his attendant, moved over towards his guest when, with even more than his usual embarrassment and a strange sort of intriguing intonation in his husky whisper, the following conversation began. "Signor, may I ask how long you have lain at this isle?" "Oh, but a day or two, Don Benito." "And from what port are you last?" "Canton." "And there, signor, you exchanged your sealskins for teas and silks, I think you said?" "Yes, silks mostly." "And the balance you took in specie, perhaps?" Captain Delano fidgeted a little, answered, "Yes, some silver, not a very great deal though." "Ah, well. May I ask how many men you have, signor?" Captain Delano slightly started, but answered, "About 25, all told." "And at present, signor, all on board, I suppose?" "All on board, Don Benito," replied the captain, now with satisfaction. "And will be tonight, signor?" At this last question, following so many pertinacious ones, for the soul of him, Captain Delano, could not but look very earnestly at the questioner, who, instead of meeting the glance with every token of craven discomposure, dropped his eyes to the deck, presenting an unworthy contrast to his servant, who, just then, was kneeling at his feet, adjusting a loose shoe buckle, his disengaged face, meantime, with humble curiosity, turned openly up into his master's downcast one. The Spaniard, still with a guilty shuffle, repeated his question. And will be tonight, signor?" "Yes, for aught I know," returned Captain Delano, "but nay," rallying himself into fearless truth, "some of them talked of going off on another fishing party about midnight. Your ships generally go more or less armed, I believe, signor?" "Oh, a 6-pounder or two, in case of emergency," was the intrepidly indifferent reply, "with a small stock of muskets, sealing spears, and cutlasses, you know." As he thus responded, Captain Delano again glanced at Don Benito, but the latter's eyes were averted, while abruptly and awkwardly shifting the subject, he made some peevish allusion to the calm, and then, without apology, once more, with his attendant, withdrew to the opposite bulwarks, where the whispering was resumed. At this, and ere Captain Delano could cast a cool thought upon what had just passed, the young Spanish sailor, before mentioned, was seen descending from the rigging. In act of stooping over to spring inboard to the deck, his voluminous, unconfined frock or shirt of coarse woolen, much spotted with tar, opened out far down the chest, revealing a soiled undergarment of what seemed the finest linen, edged about the neck with a narrow blue ribbon, sadly faded and worn. At this moment, the young sailor's eye was again fixed on the whisperers, and Captain Delano thought he observed a lurking significance in it, as if silent signs of some Freemason sort had that instant been interchanged. This once more impelled his own glance in the direction of Don Benito, and as before, he could not but infer that he himself formed the subject of the conference. He paused. The sound of the hatchet polishing fell on his ears. He cast another swift side look at the two. They had the air of conspirators. In connection with the late questionings and the incident of the young sailor, these things now begat such return of involuntary suspicion that the singular guiltlessness of the American could not endure it. Plucking up a gay and humorous expression, he crossed over to the two rapidly, saying, "Ha, Don Benito, your black here seems high in your trust, a sort of privy councillor, in fact." Upon this, the servant looked up with a good-natured grin, but the master started as from a venomous bite. It was a moment or two before the Spaniard sufficiently recovered himself to reply, which he did at last with cold constraint. "Yes, senor, I have trust in Babo." Here Babo, changing his previous grin of mere animal humour into an intelligent smile, not ungratefully eyed his master. Finding that the Spaniard now stood silent and reserved, as if involuntarily or purposely giving hint that his guest's proximity was inconvenient, just then Captain Delano, unwilling to appear uncivil even to incivility itself, made some trivial remark and moved off, again and again turning over in his mind the mysterious demeanour of Don Benito Sereno. He had descended from the poop and, wrapped in thought, was passing near a dark hatchway leading down into the steerage when, perceiving motion there, he looked to see what moved. The same instant there was a sparkle in the shadowy hatchway, and he saw one of the Spanish sailors prowling there, hurriedly placing his hand in the bosom of his frock, as if hiding something. Before the man could have been certain who it was that was passing, he slunk below out of sight, but enough was seen of him to make it sure that he was the same young sailor before noticed in the rigging. What was that which so sparkled? Thought Captain Delano. It was no lamp, no match, no live coal. Could it have been a jewel? But how come sailors with jewels? Or with silk-trimmed undershirts either? Has he been robbing the trunks of the dead cabin passengers? But if so, he would hardly wear one of the stolen articles on board ship here. Ah, if now that was indeed a secret sign I saw passing between this suspicious fellow and his captain a while since, if I could only be certain that, in my uneasiness, my senses did not deceive me, then— Here, passing from one suspicious thing to another, his mind revolved the strange questions put to him concerning his ship. By a curious coincidence, as each point was recalled, the black wizards of Ashanti would strike up with their hatchets as an ominous comment on the white stranger's thoughts. Pressed by such enigmas and portents, it would have been almost against nature had not, even into the least distrustful heart, some ugly misgivings obtruded. Observing the ship, now helplessly fallen into a current with enchanted sails, drifting with increased rapidity seaward, and noting that from a lately intercepted projection of the land, the sealer was hidden, the stout mariner began to quake at thoughts which he had barely durst confess to himself. Above all, he began to feel a ghostly dread of Don Benito, and yet when he roused himself, dilated his chest, felt himself strong on his legs, and coolly considered it, what did all these phantoms amount to? Had the Spaniard any sinister scheme? It must have reference not so much to him, Captain Delano, as to his ship, the Bachelor's Delight. Hence, the present drifting away of the one ship from the other, instead of favouring any such possible scheme, was, for the time, at least opposed to it. Clearly, any suspicion combining such contradictions must need be delusive. Besides, it was not absurd to think of a vessel in distress, a vessel by sickness almost dismanned of her crew, a vessel whose inmates were parched for water. Was it not 1,000 times absurd that such a craft should be at present of a piratical character, or her commander, either for himself or those under him, cherish any desire but for speedy relief and refreshment. But then, might not general distress and thirst in particular be affected? And might not that same undiminished Spanish crew, alleged to have perished off to a remnant, be at that very moment lurking in the hold? On heartbroken pretense of entreating a cup of cold water, fiends of human form had got into lonely dwellings, nor retired until a dark deed had been done. And among the Malay pirates, it was no unusual thing to lure ships after them into their treacherous harbours, or entice boarders from a declared enemy at sea by the spectacle of thinly manned or vacant decks, beneath which prowled 100 spears with yellow arms, ready to upthrust them through the mats. Not that Captain Delano had entirely credited such things. He had heard of them, and now as stories they recurred. The present destination of the ship was the anchorage. There she would be near his own vessel. Upon gaining that vicinity, might not the San Dominic, like a slumbering volcano, suddenly let loose energies now hid? He recalled the Spaniard's manner while telling his story. There was a gloomy hesitancy and subterfuge about it. It was just the manner of one making up his tale for evil purposes as he goes. But if that story was not true, what was the truth? That the ship had unlawfully come into the Spaniard's possession? But in many of its details, especially in reference to the more calamitous parts, just as the fatalities among the seamen, the consequent prolonged beating about, the past sufferings from obstinate calms, and still continued suffering from thirst, in all these points, as well as others, Don Benito's story had corroborated not only the wailing ejaculations of the indiscriminate multitude, white and black, but likewise what seemed impossible to be counterfeit by the very expression and play of every human feature which Captain Delano saw. If Don Benito's story was, throughout, an invention, then every soul on board, down to the youngest negress, was his carefully drilled recruit in the plot. An incredible inference. And yet, if there was ground for mistrusting his veracity, that inference was a legitimate one. But those questions of the Spaniard, there indeed one might pause. Did they not seem put with much the same object with which the burglar or assassin by daytime reconnoitres the wall of a house? But with ill purposes, to solicit such information openly of the chief person endangered, and so in effect setting him on his guard, how unlikely a procedure was that? Absurd then to suppose that those questions had been prompted by evil designs. Thus, the same conduct which, in this instance, had raised the alarm served to dispel it. In short, scarce any suspicion or uneasiness, however apparently reasonable at the time, which was not now, with equal apparent reason, dismissed. At last he began to laugh at his former forebodings, and laugh at the strange ship, for in its aspect, some way siding with them, as it were, and laugh, too, at the odd-looking blacks, particularly those scissor grinders, the Ashantis, and those bedridden old knitting women, the oakum pickers, and almost at the dark Spaniard himself, the central hobgoblin of all. For the rest, whatever in a serious way seemed enigmatical, was now good-naturedly explained away by the thought that, for the most part, the poor invalid scarcely knew what he was about, either sulking in black vapours or putting idle questions without sense or object. Evidently, for the present, the man was not fit to be instructed with the ship. On some benevolent plea withdrawing the command from him, Captain Delano would yet have to send her to Conception, in charge of his second mate, a worthy person and good navigator, a plan not more convenient for the San Dominic than for Don Benito, for, relieved from all anxiety, keeping wholly to his cabin, The sick man, under the good nursing of his servant, would probably by the end of the passage be in a measure restored to health, and with that he should also be restored to authority. Such were the Americans' thoughts. They were tranquilizing. There was a difference between the idea of Don Benito's darkly preordaining Captain Delano's fate and Captain Delano's lightly arranging Don Benito's. Nevertheless, it was not without something of relief that the good seaman presently perceived his whaleboat in the distance. Its absence had been prolonged by unexpected detention at the sealer's side, as well as its returning trip lengthened by the continual recession of the goal. The advancing speck was observed by the blacks. Their shouts attracted the attention of Don Benito, who, with a return of courtesy, approaching Captain Delano, expressed satisfaction at the coming of some supplies, slight and temporary as they must necessarily prove. Captain Delano responded, but while doing so, his attention was drawn to something passing on the deck below. Among the crowd, climbing the landward bulwarks, anxiously watching the coming boat, two blacks, to all appearances accidentally incommoded by one of the sailors, violently pushing him aside, which the sailor some way resenting, they dashed him to the deck, despite the earnest cries of the oakum pickers. "Don Benito," said Captain Delano quickly, "do you see what is going on there? Look." But seized by his cough, the Spaniard staggered, with both hands to his face, on the point of falling. Captain Delano would have supported him, but the servant was more alert, who, with one hand sustaining his master, with the other applied the cordial. Don Benito restored, the black withdrew his support, slipping aside a little, but dutifully remaining within call of a whisper. Such discretion was here evinced as quite wiped away in the visitor's eyes any blemish of impropriety which may have attached to the attendant from the indecorous conferences mentioned before, showing too that if the servant were to blame, it might be more the master's fault than his own, since, when left to himself, he could conduct thus well. His glance called away from the spectacle of disorder to the more pleasing one before him. Captain Delano could not avoid again congratulating his host upon possessing such a servant, who, though perhaps a little too forward now and then, must upon the whole be invaluable to one of the invalid's situation. "Tell me, Don Benito," he added with a smile, "I should like to have you man here myself. What will you take for him? Would 50 doubloons be any object?" "Master wouldn't part with Babbo for 1,000 doubloons," murmured the black, overhearing the offer, and taking it in earnest, and with the strange vanity of a faithful slave, appreciated by his master, scorning to hear so paltry a valuation put upon him by a stranger. But Don Benito, apparently hardly yet completely restored, and again interrupted by his cough, made but some broken reply. Soon his physical distress became so great, affecting his mind too, apparently that, as if to screen the sad spectacle, the servant gently conducted his master below. Left to himself, the American, to while away the time till his boat should arrive, would have pleasantly accosted some one of the few Spanish seamen he saw, but recalling something that Don Benito had said touching their ill conduct, he refrained, as a shipmaster indisposed to countenance cowardice or unfaithfulness in seamen. While with these thoughts, standing with eye directed forward towards that handful of sailors, suddenly he thought that one or two of them returned the glance and with a sort of meaning. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but seemed to see the same thing. Under a new form, but more obscure than any previous one, the old suspicion recurred, but in the absence of Don Benito, with less panic than before. Despite the bad account given of the sailors, Captain Delano resolved forthwith to accost one of them. Descending the poop, he made his way through the blacks, his movement drawing a queer cry from the oakum pickers, prompted by whom the Negroes, twitching each other aside, divided before him, but as if curious to see what the object of his deliberate visit to their ghetto, closing in behind in tolerable order, followed the white stranger up, his progress thus proclaimed as by mounted kings at arms, and escorted as by a Caffre guard of honour. Captain Delano, assuming a good-humoured, off-handed air, continued to advance, now and then saying a blithe word to the Negroes, and his eye curiously surveying the white faces, here and there sparsely mixed in with the blacks, like stray white pawns venturously involved in the ranks of the chessmen opposed. While thinking which of them to select for his purpose, he chanced to observe a sailor seated on the deck engaged in tarring the strap of a large block of circle of blacks squatted round him inquisitively, eyeing the process. The mean employment of the man was in contrast with something superior in his figure. His hand, black with continually thrusting it into the tar pot held for him by a Negro, seemed not naturally allied to his face, a face which would have been a very fine one but for its haggardness. Whether this haggardness had aught to do with criminality could not be determined, since as intense heat and cold, though unalike, produce sensations, so innocence and guilt, when through casual association with mental pain, stamping any visible impress, use one seal, a hacked one. Not enough that this reflection occurred to Captain Delano at the time, charitable man as he was. Rather another idea, because observing so singular a haggardness combined with the dark eye, averted as in trouble and shame, and then again recalling Don Benito's confessed ill opinion of his crew, insensibly he was operated upon by certain general notions which, while disconnecting pain and abashment from virtue, invariably link them with vice. If indeed there be any wickedness on board this ship, thought Captain Delano, be sure that man there has fouled his hand in it, even as now he fouls it in the pitch. I don't like to accost him. I will speak to this other, this old Jack here, on the windlass. He advanced to an old Barcelona tar, in ragged red breeches and dirty nightcap, cheeks drenched and bronzed, whiskers dense as thorn hedges. Seated between two sleepy-looking Africans, this mariner, like the younger shipmate, was employed upon some rigging, splicing a cable, the sleepy-looking blacks performing the inferior function of holding the outer parts of the ropes for him. Upon Captain Delano's approach, the man at once hung his head below its previous level, the one necessary for business. It appeared as if he desired to be thought absorbed with more than common fidelity in his task. Being addressed, he glanced up, but with what seemed a furtive, diffident air, which sat strangely enough on his weather-beaten visage, much as if a grizzly bear, instead of growling and biting, should simp and cast sheep's eyes. He was asked several questions concerning the voyage, questions purposely referring to several particulars in Don Benito's narrative, not previously corroborated by those impulsive cries greeting the visitor on first coming on board. The questions were briefly answered, confirming all that remained to be confirmed of the story. The Negroes about the windlass joined in with the old sailor, but as they became talkative, he by degrees became mute, and at length quite glum, seemed morosely unwilling to answer more questions, and yet all the while this ursine air was somehow mixed with his sheepish one. Despairing of ghetto into embarrassed talk with such a centaur, Captain Delano, after glancing round for a more promising countenance, but seeing none, spoke pleasantly to the blacks to make way for him, and so, amid various grins and grimaces, returned to the poop. Feeling a little strange at first, he could hardly tell why, but upon the whole, with regained confidence in Benito Cereno. How plainly, thought he, did that old whiskerando yonder betray a consciousness of ill desert. No doubt when he saw me coming, he dreaded lest I, apprised his captain of his crew's general misbehaviour, came with sharp words for him, and so down with his head. And yet, now that I think of it, that very old fellow, if I err not, was one of those who seemed so earnestly eyeing me here a while since. These creatures spin one's head round almost as much as they do the ship. Ha! There now's a pleasant sort of sunny sight, quite sociable too. His attention had been drawn to a slumbering negress, partly disclosed through the lacework of some rigging, lying with youthful limbs carelessly disposed under the lee of the bulwarks. Like a doe in the shade of a woodland rock, sprawling at her lapped breasts, was her wide-awake fawn, stark naked, its black little body half lifted from the deck, crosswise with its dams, its hands, like two paws, clambering upon her, its mouth and nose ineffectually rooting to get at the mark, and meantime giving a vexatious half-grunt, blending with the composed snore of the negress. The uncommon vigour of the child at length roused the mother. She started up, at a distance facing Captain Delano, but as if not at all concerned at the attitude which she had been caught. Delightedly she caught the child up, with maternal transports, covering it with kisses. There's naked nature now, pure tenderness and love, thought Captain Delano, well pleased. This incident prompted him to remark the other negresses more particularly than before. He was gratified with their manners. Like most uncivilized women, they seemed at once tender of heart and tough of constitution, equally ready to die for their infants or fight for them. Unsophisticated as leopardesses, loving as doves. Ah, thought Captain Delano, these perhaps are some of the very women who Ledyard saw in Africa and gave such a noble account of. These natural sights somehow insensibly deepened his confidence and ease. At last he looked to see how his boat was getting on, but it was still pretty remote. He turned to see if Don Benito had returned, but he had not. To change the scene, as well as to please himself with a leisurely observation of the coming boat, stepping over into the mizzen chains, he clambered his way into the starboard quarter gallery, one of those abandoned Venetian-looking water balconies previously mentioned, retreats cut off from the deck. As his foot pressed the half-damp, half-dry sea mosses matting the place, and a chance phantom cat's paw, an islet of breeze, unheralded, unfollowed, as this ghostly cat's paw came fanning his cheek, as his glance fell upon the row of small, round, dead lights, all closed like coppered eyes of the confined, and the state cabin door, once connecting with the gallery, even as the dead lights had once looked out upon it, but now corked fast like a sarcophagus lid, and to a purple-black, tarred-over panel, threshold and post, and he bethought him of the time when that state cabin and this state balcony had heard the voices of the Spanish king's officers, and the forms of the Lima viceroy's daughters had perhaps leaned where he stood, as these and other images flitted through his mind, as the cat's paw through the calm. Gradually he felt rising a dreamy inquietude, like that one who alone on the prairie feels unrest from the repose of the noon. He leaned against the carved balustrade again looking off towards his boat, but found his eye falling upon the ribbon grass trailing along the ship's waterline, straight as a border of green box and parterres of seaweed, broad ovals and crescents, floating nigh and far, with what seemed long formal alleys between, crossing the terraces of swells and sweeping round as if leading to the grottos below. And overhanging all was the balustrade by his arm, which, partly stained with pitch and partly embossed with sea moss, seemed the charred ruin of some summer house in a grand garden long running to waste. Trying to break one charm, he was but becharmed anew. Though upon the wide sea he seemed in some fair inland country, prisoner in some deserted chateau, left to stare at empty grounds and peer out at vague roads where never wagon or wayfarer passed. But these enchantments were a little disenchanted as his eye fell on the corroded main chains. Of an ancient style, massy and rusty in link, shackle and bolt, they seemed even more fit for the ship's present business than the one for which she had been built. Presently he thought something moved nigh the chains. He rubbed his eyes and looked hard. Groves of rigging were about the chains, and there, peering from behind a great stay, like an Indian from behind a hemlock, a Spanish sailor, a marling spike in his hand, was seen, who made what seemed an imperfect gesture toward the balcony, but immediately, as if alarmed by some advancing step along the deck within, vanished into the recesses of the hempen forest like a poacher. What meant this? Something the man had sought to communicate, unbeknown to anyone, even to his captain. Did the secret involve aught unfavourable to his captain? Were those previous misgivings of Captain Delano's about to be verified? Or, in his haunted mood at the moment, had some random, unintentional motion of the man, while busy in the stay, as if repairing it, been mistaken for a significant beckoning? Not unbewiled, again he gazed off for his boat, but it was temporarily hidden by a rocky spur in the Arle. As with some eagerness he bent forward, watching for the first shooting view of its beak. The balustrade gave way before him like charcoal. Had not he clutched an outreaching rope, he would have fallen into the sea. The crash, though feeble, and the fall, though hollow, of the rotten fragments must have been overheard. He glanced up with sober curiosity. Peering down upon him was one of the old oakum pickers, slipped from his perch to an outside boom, while below the old negro, and invisible to him, reconnoitering from the porthole like a fox from the mouth of its den, crouched the Spanish sailor again. From something suddenly suggested by the man's air, the mad idea now departed into Captain Delano's mind that Don Benito's plea of indisposition in withdrawing below was but a pretense that he was engaged there maturing his plot, of which the sailor, by some means gaining an inkling, had a mind to warn the stranger against, incited, it may be, by gratitude for a kind word on first boarding the ship. Was it from foreseeing some possible interference like this that Don Benito had beforehand given such a bad character of his sailors while praising the negroes, though indeed the former seemed as docile as the latter the contrary? The whites too by nature were the shrewder race. A man with some evil design, would he not be likely to speak well of that stupidity which was blind to his depravity, and malign that intelligence from which it might not be hidden? Not unlikely, perhaps, but if the whites had dark secrets concerning Don Benito, could then Don Benito be any way in complicity with the blacks? Besides, whoever heard of a white so far a renegade as to apostatize from his very species almost by leaguing in against it with the negroes? These difficulties recalled former ones. Lost in their mazes, Captain Delano had now regained the deck, was uneasily advancing along it when he observed a new face, an aged sailor seated cross-legged near the main hatchway. His skin was shrunk up with wrinkles like a pelican's empty pouch, his hair frosted, his countenance grave and composed. His hands were full of ropes which he was working into a large knot. Some blacks were about him, obligingly dipping the strands for him, here and there, as the exigencies of the operation demanded. Captain Delano crossed over to him and stood in silence surveying the knot, his mind, by a not uncongenial transition, passing from its own entanglements to those of the hemp. For intricacy, such a knot he had never seen in an American ship, nor indeed any other. The old man looked like an Egyptian priest making Gordian knot for the temple of Ammon. The knot seemed a combination of double bowline knot, treble crown knot, back-handed well knot, knot in and out knot, and jamming knot. At last, puzzled to comprehend the meaning of such a knot, Captain Delano addressed the knotter. "What are you knotting there, my man?" "The knot," was the brief reply without looking up. "So it seems, but what is it for?" "For someone else to undo," muttered back the old man, plying his fingers harder than ever, the knot now being nearly completed. While Captain Delano stood watching him, suddenly the old man threw the knot towards him, saying in broken English, the first heard in the ship, something to this effect. "Undo it, cut it quick." It was said lowly, but with such condensation of rapidity that the long, slow words in Spanish, which had preceded and followed, almost operated as covers to the brief English between. For a moment, knot in hand and knot in head, Captain Delano stood mute, while, without further heeding him, the old man was now intent upon other ropes. Presently, there was a slight stir behind Captain Delano. Turning, he saw the chained negro, Atufal, standing quietly there. The next moment, the old sailor rose, muttering, and, followed by his subordinate negroes, removed to the forward part of the ship, where in the crowd he disappeared. An elderly negro, in a clout like an infant's, with a pepper and salt head, and a kind of attorney air, now approached Captain Delano in tolerable Spanish and with a good-natured, knowing wink. He informed him that the old knotter was simple-witted, but harmless, often playing his old tricks. The negro concluded by begging the knot, for of course the stranger would not care to be troubled with it. Unconsciously, it was handed to him. With a sort of congé, the negro received it, and turning his back, ferreted into it like a detective custom house officer after smuggled laces. Soon, with some African word, he tossed the knot overboard. All this is very queer now, thought Captain Delano, with a qualmish sort of emotion, but as one feeling incipient seasickness, he strove, by ignoring the symptoms, to get rid of the malady. Once more he looked off from his boat. To his delight, it was now again in view, leaving the rocky spur astern. The sensation here experienced after at his relieving his uneasiness, with unforeseen efficacy, soon began to remove it. The less distant sight of that well-known boat showing it, not as before, half blended with the haze, but with outline defined, so that its individuality, like a man's, was manifest. That boat, Rover by name, which, though now in strange seas, had often pressed the beach of Captain Delano's home, and brought to its threshold for repairs, had familiarly lain there as a Newfoundland dog. The sight of that household boat evoked 1,000 trustful associations, which, contrasted with previous suspicions, filled him not only with lightsome confidence, but somehow with half-humorous self-reproaches of his former lack of it. What? I, Amasa Delano, Jack of the Beach, as they called me when a lad, I, Amasa, the same that, duck satchel in hand, used to paddle along the waterside to the schoolhouse made from the old hulk. I, little Jack of the Beach, that used to go berrying with cousin Nat and the rest. I to be murdered here at the hands of the earth, on board a haunted pirate ship by a horrible Spaniard? Too nonsensical to think of. Who would murder Amasa Delano? His conscience is clean. There is someone above. Fee, fi, Jack of the Beach, you are a child indeed, a child of the second childhood, old boy. You are beginning to dote and drool, I'm afraid. Light of heart and foot, he stepped aft, and there was met by Don Benito's servant who, with a pleasing expression responsive to his own present feelings, informed him that his master had recovered from the effects of his coughing fit, and had just ordered him to go present his compliments to his good guest, Don Amasa, and say that he, Don Benito, would soon have the happiness to rejoin him. There now, do you mark that? Again, thought Captain Delano, walking the poop. What a donkey I was! This kind gentleman, who here sends me his kind compliments, he but 10 minutes ago, dark lantern in hand, was dodging round some old grindstone in the hold, sharpening a hatchet for me, I thought. Well, well, these long calms have a morbid effect on the mind. I've often heard, though I never believed it before. Ha! Glancing toward the boat, there's Rover, good dog, a white bone in her mouth. A pretty big bone, though, seems to me. What? Yes, she has fallen foul of the building, of the bubbling tide rip there. It sets her the other way, too, for the time. Patience. It was now about noon, though from the greyness of everything, it seemed to be getting towards dusk. The calm was confirmed. In the far distance, away from the influence of land, the leaden ocean seemed laid out and leaded up, its course finished, soul gone, defunct. But the current from landward, where the ship was, increased, silently sweeping her further and further towards the tranced waters beyond. Still, from his knowledge of those latitudes, cherishing hopes of a breeze and a fair and fresh one at any moment, Captain Delano, despite present prospects, buoyantly counted upon bringing the San Dominic safely to anchor ere night. The distance swept over was nothing, since, with a good wind, 10 minutes sailing would retrace more than 60 minutes drifting. Meantime, one moment turning to mark Rover fighting the tide rip, and the next to see Don Benito approaching, he continued walking the poop. Gradually he felt a vexation arising from the delay of his boat. This soon merged into uneasiness, and at last, his eye falling continually, as from a strange box into the pit, upon the strange crowd before and below him, and by, recognizing that the face, now composed to indifference, of the Spanish sailor who had seemed to beckon from the main chains, something of his old trepidations returned. Ah, thought he, gravely enough, this is like the ague, because it went off. It follows not that it won't come back. Though ashamed of the relapse, he could not altogether subdue it, and so exerting his good nature to the utmost, insensibly he came to a compromise. Yes, this is a strange craft, a strange history too, and strange folks on board, but nothing more. By way of keeping his mind out of mischief till the boat should arrive, he tried to occupy it with turning over and over in a purely speculative sort of way some lesser peculiarities of the captain and crew. Among others, 4 curious points recurred. Firstly, The affair of the Spanish lad assailed with a knife by the slave boy, an act winked at by Don Benito. Second, the tyranny of Don Benito's treatment of Atufal, the Black, as if a child should lead a bull off the Nile by the ring of his nose. Third, the trampling of the sailor by the two Negroes, a piece of insolence passed over without so much as a reprimand. Fourth, the cringing submission to their master of all the ship's underlings, mostly blacks, as if by the least inadvertence they feared to draw down his despotic displeasure. Coupling these points, they seemed somewhat contradictory. But what then, thought Captain Delano, glancing towards his now nearing boat? What then? Why, Don Benito is a very capricious commander, but he is not the first of the sort I have seen, though it's true he rather exceeds any other. But as a nation, continued he in his reveries, these Spaniards are all an odd set. The very word Spaniard has a curious conspirator, Guy Fawkish twang to it. And yet I dare say Spaniards in the main are as good folks as any in Duxbury, Massachusetts. Ah, good. Last rover has come. As with its welcome freight, the boat touched the side, the oakum pickers,